Well, hi. How's it going? This is the third installation in the third chapter of How to Do Nothing. So this is a Ricky reading series production. This is the first book I've been going through. And for the past 2 weeks, we've been doing a chapter a week and sort of a weekly reading series stream where basically I kind of summarize the book, kind of my own reactions, the conversations that happened in my Discord around that reading. There's a link to join that Discord down below, so you should give that a click, because we basically talk about this book, anime, and horse girls, and animes about horse girls. That's a very, I think, fair assessment of what that has turned into. But beyond that, getting back to the point of departure, this is the third chapter of Odell's work, How to Do Nothing, which is going to be getting into some new territory. I mean, the title of this chapter was The Anatomy of Refusal, which I think is it's a good fit for here. It's not really talking so much about what does refusal look like in a total way, but more sort of what are the necessary conditions for refusal to take place. So where do we need to get first to be able to resist the attention economy? So let's get into it. Please work. Yes, thank you, Blackboard. Okay, so let's recap real quick. Last time we talked in chapter 2 about the realities of the commune movement, the way that people necessarily were trying to sort of flee in desperation from the impending sense of doom and dread that they were feeling, and that this ultimately sort of sowed the seeds for the dissolution of the commune movement, because it turns out that trying to see the world in black and white, wherein you are either going to fully participate in the system or you are either going to be fully outside of the system, is a immature response. And we talked about Thomas Merton and sort of his belief and his development as in thought as a Trappist monk, wherein his removal into an ascetic order and retreat from society also gave him the perspective to realize that he really needed to be part of the world and he needed to be interacting with people. And so Odell's writing really gets into this idea that it's not about total retreat. It's not about this sort of desperate attempt to escape. It's about finding ways to resist. And it's and that resistance in itself is a third option, which is more sustainable and ultimately probably going to be more fruitful for people that are looking for ways to get out of the situation that they find themselves in, which is one where they are aware that sort of the world is not what they wanted it to be, and they're not necessarily sure where to go with it. So before we get into that, though, we need to talk about a couple of things. Let's get into chapter 3. Like I said, it's called The Anatomy of Refusal. And we're going to talk about what does resistance look like. We're going to talk about a lot of radical history. We're going to get into unions, strikes, just radical slave abolitionist action. And hopefully we're going to leave with a little bit of perspective, maybe answer that question. What does resistance look like in the age of the attention economy? All right, but first, we got to talk about something. I've been waiting for this one for a long time. This whole reading series has been it's been a Trojan horse to set up for me to be able to talk about my personal favorite television show, Police Squad. So what is Police Squad? It's an old television show from the 1980s. I want to say 1970s? I'm blanking on it now. Suffice to say, it's basically a spoof police procedural, and even it's from the title giving it away. So one of the big things is that it was very heavily advertised as being a show in color. But yeah, guess what? It turns out that being in color was actually a very normal thing by the time the show aired. And yeah, unfortunately, if it didn't really find an audience and ended up being canceled after about 6 episodes. But in those 6 episodes, which you should totally watch if you ever get a chance, it went in a rapid-fire pace of deadpan humor, as characterized by being from the same writers of Airplane. It subverted the police procedural tropes, basically lampooning some of the goofy sort of either the camera angles and cinematic tropes or even the story beats that procedurals and detective shows at the time would go through to highlight their absurdity and to really play within the space of genre convention in order to create humor. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that wasn't a great, like I said, it wasn't a great trajectory, and it ended up being canceled after only 6 episodes, which means it's a very short watch if you're looking to get into it, and I highly recommend it. Because really the world was not ready. At the time, and some sort of retrospectives on the show have pointed out, this sort of style of humor of playing with convention and kind of dancing in and out of space, and yeah, and it absolutely did all of that in color. But the world wasn't ready for it. And in fact, test audiences and people of the time frequently kind of looked back on it and said, like, what is this? I don't understand. It's kind of breaking my expectations for what a show like this should be. It has the tropes, it has the design, it has the titles. They even got a very famous narrator who had worked in a lot of sort of police procedural shows to do the narration work for the episodes. And so audiences were left confused. They didn't really know what to make of this very bizarre and weird show. And it kind of failed to find an audience for daring to defy those conventions. But later on, shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine would basically take the same formula and find a tremendous degree of success. Take it as you were. But Police Squad will always be near and dear to my heart, which is why I'm plugging it as part of my reading series. Anyway, but this is a reading series. It's not about TV. That's going to be that will be the following sequence where we talk about an episode breakdown of why Police Squad is the greatest show ever made. But it and shows like it used humor rooted in genre convention subversion in order to get laughs and to make jokes. Odell talks about this style of humor and the style of comedy specifically by looking at comedian Tom Green, which if you were ever on 4chan at a particular point in your life, you can probably hear this image. A barrel roll. A barrel roll? A barrel roll. Yeah. But the particular gag that Odell wants to put out is that there's a, honestly, great comedy bit that Tom Green did, where he basically walks along a sidewalk, gradually slows down until he just lays down on the ground, and then you just kind of see what people are doing. The humor comes in people's reactions to this unexpected situation. There's nothing illegal about laying down on a sidewalk. There's nothing illegal about walking slowly, and yet people generally build up these situational expectations of what should be happening in this type of situation. That is to say, I'm on a sidewalk, I'm walking, I am literally walking here, and then suddenly this person in front of me lays down on the ground, and it makes for a humorous absurdity. Why does this work? Well, breaking into a little bit, pulling back from the sociological and into the psychological, we are extremely adept at pattern recognition as creatures. If you really want to break it down, it might be the greatest characteristic of the human mind, is that our ability to organize information, and particularly to use that information to organize a mental impression or blueprint or a schema of the world, and then to use that when we encounter novel situations. It was popularized by Piaget, who you also might remember as a foundational French learning theorist. So basically, over time, when I say schemas, we build up heuristics over time. It's a heuristic technique, the first typo in this reading series, I'm sorry, which we use generally to reduce cognitive load. That is to say that in situations where I encounter something new, let's say I tune into a stream, I tune into a VTuber stream, and I have watched that before. I know the memes, I know the jokes. I've generally built up the repertoire of what these sort of the norms and the terms are, so that I don't need to have them explained to me. I have a basic idea of what sort of the etiquette is. So if I encounter a new VTubing performer, I know that the etiquette and the norm is that you don't talk about the person's real life, even if you do know about it. So I know that, hey, I've encountered this new person. My friend has started VTubing as a character. I'm not going to address them as their real name. Kind of how stuff like this works. Or maybe you're at a work conference and you walk into a happy hour and you're around your work people, but people are drinking, maybe ties are loosened, and that those signals kick off into your brain that maybe this is a more casual circumstance or maybe a more casual event, and maybe you can be a little bit more loosey-goosey while you're interacting with your colleagues. You don't need to be told that. You can infer that based on the situation. And schemas can kind of be loosely extrapolated, and that's going to be a thing we'll revisit later in this talk, and how we can really go back and we can think about some of these individual psychological concepts and extrapolate them to sort of their summary in sort of the macro level. That is to say that when people share schemas, people share expectations, they become social norms or cognitive norms. We gradually build up impressions and build up this idea of what the world is supposed to be, and correspondingly, why humor like this works. Now, you might have seen this TikTok. It's brilliant. I yelled the first time I was watching it because I got frustrated. But let's give it a listen. Gotta fix one quick audio thing. Got one thing going on here. Give me a second here. Sorry about that. Here we go.
Square. Can you guess which spot that goes in?
Square.
That's right. It goes in the square hole.
Hell yeah. Look how proud she is.
And how about this rectangle? That one?
Also the square.
That goes in there too.
Yeah.
Up next, we've got this thin rectangle.
The thin
Can you guess
rectangle.
where that goes?
The thin rectangle.
That's right. It goes in the square hole. And up next,
No.
a cylinder.
The circle.
I think that goes in
The circle.
the square hole. Now, we've also got this semicircle right
Look
here.
at her smile and
Do you
optimism
see
gone.
a slot that would fit
The semicircle.
semicircle?
The semicircle.
That's right. It's the square hole. Okay. Up next, the triangle. We know what hole that goes
The
into,
triangle.
right?
Triangle.
That's right. The square hole. And up next, we have the arch.
The arch.
You guessed it.
The arch.
It goes in the square hole.
Just absolutely devastated. And so, like, if you're like me, you probably had a reaction to that the first time you watched it. And part of it is because, guess what? I have built up, and you have probably built up, expectations for how you're supposed to play that game. The circle goes in the circle, the square goes in the square. Never mind that all of them can go in the square. That's not allowed. It's just not a thing that we necessarily consider because as we develop these sorts of schemas and expectations, it turns out they can also limit the way that we think about things. And it takes certain people and certain styles of humor to maybe break us out of those expectations and show us that maybe certain options and certain solutions exist that we weren't necessarily thinking about before, right? So enter Diogenes. Odell brings up Diogenes in particular as an example of just this kind of person. Back in ancient Greece, this dude was a dick. He was an asshole. He comes back, he is laying down there, and who should come to visit him but literally Alexander the Great. Fan of the famous philosopher Diogenes, Alexander the Great comes up to him and says, "I have found you, Diogenes. Please, tell me, give me some wisdom." And what does Diogenes tell him? "Can you please step out of my sun? I am literally laying here." In many ways, actually, Diogenes' sense of humor and style of teaching laid the groundwork for irony-poisoned podcasters. So if you ever listen to Chapo Trap House, you know who to thank. But on a more serious note, there's a lot of really important stuff to consider here with Diogenes, both in his sense of, I guess, what we could call humor, but really teaching and edification. At the time, he was referred to as Socrates gone mad. So whereas Socrates was off teaching, and then later on his students, Plato and Aristotle, had a particular formalized way of talking about the world and morals and philosophy, Diogenes really broke that mold in very important ways. And he wasn't just Socrates gone mad, he had a very reasoned way of interacting with the world. So he looked around the world and he looked around at society and he said, "This sucks. It's based in greed and ignorance and corruption. And so, if I am to participate in this society that I see as being founded in these things that I do not like, well, then I am just supporting these things that I would otherwise oppose." And so, we get this quote from Diogenes, and then brought up in Odell's work, "I will participate, but not as asked." At the time, he's goofing off. Someone could would you please just play the game by the rules that we have specified? And Diogenes looked down and he whispered, "No." You really think about that. Like some of the examples that come up in the book, and I'm not going to go exhaustively through them, but they're ridiculous. And all of which are coming from this same root ethic that this is the world that I live in is one that I see based in greed, ignorance, and corruption. But rather than messing off into the woods and becoming a hermit, I'm going to find ways to highlight the cracks in the system, to ridicule it, and to highlight the ways that sort of these fundamental, what I see as a fundamental absurdity, is working to reassert itself and do what I consider to be causing harm, and maybe show other people that there are other ways that things could work out. Yes, that is correct. Diogenes was in fact the first Sigma male. Yeah, and it's a good point, Raina. that you really think about and you look back, a lot of the old big classical philosophers, a lot of them were really into slavery. Whereas someone like Diogenes might, well, I don't know specifically about Diogenes in this case, but the general tenet might be that, and we'll talk about Thoreau later, if you see that, hey, society at large seems really chill with slavery, maybe you find ways to poke holes in that and to try to resist and ultimately work against the slave state that you see is so objectionable. So the term that Odell coins to talk about sort of this category of person is a refusenik. And what connects Diogenes, and then sort of as a intellectual and cultural predecessor to these people, is this core idea of seeking a third space between denial and participation. Remember, this is what came up in the previous reading series with Thomas Merton, that it's not, you can't just not participate. Even with the sort of the core root idea of the communes that we talked about in the last reading series, the fundamental tenet they tried to build themselves on was that we can just go and start over. And a lot of them crumbled because the foundation that they were building on wasn't realistic. They carried the tenets of capitalism and alienation with them into the communes. And so eventually the people that had sort of tried to escape and tried to build a new society realized, hey, this wasn't realistic, and they just kind of relapsed back into the fold, back into participating in the society, believing that denial and escape were impossible. So I mentioned him before, but our good friend Henry David Thoreau, or David Henry Thoreau, lord of pseudonyms and really, really bad pen names, really does fall under this label. As much as I gave him crap over Walden and the circumstances over which Walden was written, there is some genuine praxis and refusal that goes along with Thoreau's history. So, disillusioned by racism and U.S. imperialism, particularly U.S. expansion into Mexican territory, Thoreau decided he wasn't going to pay taxes anymore. He looked at the world, he saw the state of things, and we have slavery, we have imperialism, we're trying to have a war with Mexico. And what he saw, it's like, well, that's so much slavery, but racism. But the ongoing sort of racial apartheid of the United States, coupled with its actions abroad, brought Thoreau to a point where he just said, you know what? I'm not going to participate anymore. I'm not going to give money to a government that is using that money, is using my tax dollars to engage in activities that I don't approve of. And consequently, he was jailed for refusing to pay his taxes. But he actually did time in jail. So good for you, Henry Thoreau. And in terms of the world of fiction, Odell brings up the story of Bartleby the Scrivener, which is, maybe you've come across it in classic American literature, that in this story, oh, I didn't know that, thank you, Raina, like Diogenes was in fact sold as a slave at one point. All right. So, Bartleby the Scrivener, a classic American story written by Herman Melville, basically follows this tenet of Bartleby. He's a Scrivener, I guess you could even call him something like a paralegal in modern terms, where the lawyer that he's working for comes up to him and says, Bartleby, would you please file these forms? Would you please do this task? And then one day Bartleby just says, I'd prefer not to. He doesn't say yes. He doesn't say no. He just says, like, I don't feel like it. And at first it's humorous in terms of the reaction the lawyer gets. He is sort of catapulted by this revelation. Like, all of a sudden, this person who works for him is saying, yeah, I don't feel like doing that. And it goes on. At first, he refuses to do work. It later on goes on to Bartleby refusing to disclose any information about himself. And ultimately, that lawyer leaves. Bartleby goes on to work for somebody else, and that somebody is not quite as tolerant of Bartleby's refusal to do work. And he ends up in prison, and unlike Thoreau, who had contacts and assets and resources that allowed him to post bail, Bartleby does not, and the character of Bartleby dies in prison. It was very weird to me to see this story brought up in this context. It's not a happy one, but I can see it is an interesting revelation and a way of framing this discussion of refuseniks, because not every story of refusal has a happy ending. Not everyone is humored like Diogenes was. In some cases, the people that try to resist or try to go against the grain or highlight the absurdity of the system that they live in find themselves imprisoned or worse. which is I want to talk about one person and one example I was actually surprised wasn't talked about in the course of the reading. It's the story of John Brown, John motherfucking Brown, and just to kind of set the tone for discussing John Brown, I want to start off with one of my favorite quotes from the radical abolitionist of his age, radical even by his time, John Brown. "I'm quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." So what is the context of this? He's talking about this guilty land, bloodshed. John Brown was a radical abolitionist. In leading into the Civil War, John Brown was a extremist even by his own time, and truly radical in every sense of the word. Going from a highly religious upbringing and a highly religious background, he eventually came to believe that there was no way that America could be a just land due to its acceptance of slavery at any point in time. In fact, he came to believe ultimately that the only way to really have a land that was based in the tenets of fairness and the values that this new country was starting to try to profess itself on was to say, well, we gotta start over. And if that means a lot of bloodshed, it's going to mean a lot of bloodshed. He saw no other way that this could possibly go down, which led to, in October 1859, he leads a raid on Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. It's actually, there's a John Brown Museum there now. I've visited the historic town. It's actually pretty cool. Highly recommend doing it if you ever have a chance or you're in the area. But at the dead of night, he and his children led a raid on Harper's Ferry where there was a federal arms storage with the aim of capturing the town, liberating these weapons, and arming freed people and slaves with the intention of instigating a slave revolt. This is really where this is what John Brown's line of thinking came to. Whereas Thoreau maybe stopped paying taxes, John Brown saw that it was only radical, and in this case, violent action that would have been able to really resist what he saw as a systemic and fundamental problem in the very foundation of the American project. And as you may know, his raid on Harper's Ferry did fail. He was captured and was the first American executed for treason. Said there's a museum dedicated to him, a wax museum in Harper's Ferry. So if you're ever around West Virginia in the Mid-Atlantic, it's definitely worth giving a stop. But he's a radical figure of American history that doesn't get talked about a lot, probably for very systemic reasons. But I think he's a very important person to talk about here. Because when we talk about refusal, and we talk about what that works, like how that looks, for people that try to talk about and expose systemic problems that they see in the world, they don't always have happy endings. It's actually oftentimes they have sad endings, and not everyone has the same capacity to refuse. In the case of John Brown, it's like he had some political capital, and his attempts to inspire a slave rebellion didn't necessarily take hold for maybe some reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. But keep him in mind as we go forward here. So, like with many cases of public refusal, John Brown's attempts to instigate a slave revolt really fall under this idea of sort of public displays of refusal. Leading up to his attempts to actually instigate violence, he was a public figure. He was trying to rally people to this cause of radical abolition. And yet what he found was that he wasn't necessarily finding or connecting with many like-minded figures. I actually came across a quote from Abraham Lincoln at the time, who was like, that John Brown guy, this is paraphrasing, that John Brown guy has some good ideas, but boy, he's like off his rocker. And yet, even though he might not have been necessarily finding the audience he was looking for, these kinds of public displays of refusal are intended to attract like-minded thinkers. Even in the case of Thoreau, who, he had connections, he was able to be bailed out of jail for when he was imprisoned for avoiding his taxes. But he ultimately went on to pen some classic essays on civil disobedience. And of course, because guess what? His attempts at refusal were not meant to just be condensed to the individual. He saw systemic problems in the country that he was living in, and he wanted to speak out against them as a means of trying to attract and communicate with like-minded people. And so Odell talks about this sort of the history of collective action and this attempt to garner and organize with like-minded people and attempts to sort of instigate collective refusal. And to do that, she uses the example of West Coast longshoremen working in the 1930s. So up until that point, the life of a longshoreman was hard. Like they had very little security, they had very little capital, they had very little autonomy in what their workday actually looked like. In fact, actually, Odell points that it wasn't atypical for a longshoreman shift to last anywhere from 2 to 18 hours. Just think about that. Imagine going to a job and then thinking, well, today might be an 18-hour day, today might be a 2-hour day. You never know. I don't have much security. I don't have much stability in the way that I'm working or living. And yet, I don't necessarily have the overhead to be able to really say anything. Because if anyone ever spoke up about the issues that they were facing, well, the odds are we're not going to be working much longer. That wasn't until 1932, where the Waterfront Worker, basically a short magazine, starts to circulate among longshoremen. And it speaks to this unspoken resentment that workers were feeling toward the system that they were working in. It was basically a zine of the time. This was sort of a short publication that became popular in this circle of workers, talking about a lot of these same issues: the lack of security, low wages, the lack of benefits, etc., etc., etc. And yet, it wasn't until 1933, with the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, that things really kick into gear. So what does the National Industrial Recovery Act do? It guarantees workers the ability to form and join unions. So at the time, prior to this, the longshoremen, for the extent that they had unions and union representation, were really work halls or orgs that were managed not so much by longshoremen or by their peers, but by paid union representatives, basically bureaucrats, that didn't necessarily speak to or understand the plights that the longshoremen were dealing with. Following the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act and the formation of a dock workers union, dock workers agreed to strike, and thousands of workers came together and organized a work stoppage here on the West Coast. And I want to talk about this. So a strike is only as strong as it can be continuous. If you as an employer know that your employees can only afford to strike for only a couple of days or a couple of weeks, it's easy to wait out the strike. And it's also possible to put your thumb on the scale. And so the owners of the docks started to put a little bit of a pressure on the dock workers. They started to hire strike breakers or scabs to fill in. They authored and penned and publicized letters in local newspapers fomenting racism among the dock workers, trying to point out the racial discrepancies and racial disparities between black and white workers, trying to speak to the prevalent racism of the day. And trying to really using racism as a wedge to turn workers against each other. And they even ran pleading ads. It's saying like, oh, come on. Just like, this is ridiculous. It's gone on for so long. Just like, be reasonable. Come on. And despite their efforts, the strike held. And, there's a long history that I could get very deep into about employer efforts, particularly around this historical period, to really break the efforts of organized labor. You may actually be familiar with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, a org that really came to national notoriety around strike breaking, up into and including murdering workers and murdering or physically assaulting workers and union organizers as a means of breaking strikes. And in some cases, some historians actually point to the Pinkertons as sort of the blueprint for the modern CIA and the modern FBI. Let's see, catching up with chat. Yes, it's actually not dissimilar from Amazon. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And yep. Pinkwashing is also definitely a thing where it comes to saying like, oh, look how progressive we are, especially in the month of Pride. The number of times I've seen corporations, they switched over to the rainbow icon and everything to really mask this idea that they're very progressive. And it's like, oh, come on. We're Raytheon. We're very progressive. Haven't you seen we have the progress flag in our icon this month? Like, we can't be bad. It's so great to work for us. right? So anyway, the strike goes on and then ultimately leads into the general strike of 1934. So we're looking at 1933. We have in this timeline the dock workers are able to unionize. 1934, and then at the time up to 1934, there's a dock worker strike. But something happens in 1934. Two workers, well, a worker and a volunteer, are murdered by police. The dock workers attempt to erect a memorial at the site where they are murdered, and the police tear down the memorial, which leads to a second confrontation between the striking workers and the police. But something happens here. So whereas before the competition, or sort of the opposition, was between the employers and the police and the striking workers, the display of police brutality against the workers jogs something in the local community. And the community rallies around the workers, and what was before thousands of dock workers turns into 150,000 people in San Francisco, I believe San Francisco, correct me if I'm wrong, walking off the job in a general strike. And this marked the turning point in the strike. At that point, the ability for the community to rally around them and exert collective action and collective force through that withdrawal ultimately sealed the strike for the dock workers. And it's like, whereas before it might have gone on for much longer, they might not have been able to be successful. Being able to rally such a massive amount of collective attention and action is what really sealed the deal for them. So let's talk about that. Before, in this book, attention was always talked about at the individual level. So we've talked about Facebook, we've talked about content creation, we've talked about YouTube, we've talked about targeted advertisements, we've talked about the inundation of information and the ways that it's used to really atomize us and make us feel insecure, or to draw up parasocial relationships or connections between content creators to drive us to use certain products or purchase certain services. But attention doesn't just work at the individual level, because individual action and individual attention filters up to collective levels. That is to say that at the sort of the macro level, when you think about groups of people, collective attention and collective agency, aka collective action, relies on the individual ability to pay attention, and the summation of a lot of individual being able to connect, organize, and direct their attention toward the same outlets and the same outcomes. Conversely, when we think about this on the back to the individual level, though, attention overload, whether it's at the behest of the individual or even in the community level. Odell actually specifically brings up the idea of thinking about the collective sense of attention as much like a big individual. And just like an individual person, if they can't focus on their attention, and if they can't focus their attention on anything, they end up scattered, reactive, and prone to reactionary politics, much like a collective. And reactivity leads to fear, to anger, to hysteria. And we kind of saw this with the commune movement. Each of these people, they break out, they try to move on and try to establish these new collectives, but for any number of reasons are unable to really establish a sense of collective agency or collective action. And without that ability to attend to the same point, to sort of combine their attention into a collective, these communes ultimately fall apart. And they fall apart along these kinds of same lines of reactionary politics and sort of fear, anger, and resentment. Yoda might have been onto something with this idea that fear is the path to the dark side. In this case, reactivity and reactionary, and being a reactionary. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering, and yada, yada, yada. All right. You do love this puppet here. All right. So, moving on, kind of summarizing, we've talked about at this point, what does refusal look like? It seems that collective refusal is sort of the golden ticket, right? Individual strikers don't tend to cause systemic change. But over 100,000 people walking out on their jobs is usually sometimes what it would take in the form of a general strike to really establish and challenge sort of the collective environment that we all live in. That is to say, you need collective action to address systemic problems. So, why might someone not necessarily participate? Why might someone not refuse? Even if they recognize that the system that they are participating in is not necessarily a good one. Well, it turns out refusal is costly. Like I said before, when we think about Thoreau was imprisoned for not paying taxes, right? But he also had connections. Remember, when he wrote Walden, he was basically car camping on Ralph Waldo Emerson's land. And when he was thrown in prison, he had someone else who was able to pay his fine. He didn't have to sit there for very long. He had means, protection, and cover that allowed him to then not only refuse by not paying taxes, but to go on and then author his essays on civil disobedience. And not everyone has that same luxury. Take, for example, Rosa Parks. After refusing to give up her seat on a bus, Rosa Parks was unable to find employment for many, many years. In fact, it came to the point where she needed to be supported by members of the civil rights movement. And so she needed to have a community that could support her while she was paying the individual cost for refusing to participate in a system that she saw as unjust. And even connecting again to the civil rights movement, this is something I didn't actually know. Sit-ins and organized sit-ins were predominantly participated in by college students. These weren't the product of a big community action, and in fact, sit-ins were actually a controversial tactic of the time. And older, non-college students, they didn't have that same luxury to be able to refuse and to sort of make trouble, were actually very critical of this approach. Odell points out a couple of choice quotes from older African Americans at the time, seeing these younger college kids that are going here and they're organizing these sit-ins and they're organizing these protests, and they saw themselves as being imperiled. Older generations that didn't have the same cover were afraid of and critical of these movements because they thought that maybe they were going to lose what little security they had. Think about that for a second. I never really considered it. It's a piece of history I didn't personally know. And in fact, so these students had a lot of agency. One of the book actually points to a quote from a professor or the president of one of the colleges popular among these students, or a lot of sit-in participants were attending, saying that they were encouraged even. They didn't have to worry about being kicked out of school. In fact, the school saw them as actualizing their liberal educational values. Which kind of puts things in context, right? Refusal is hard. If an individual refuses, if an individual dock worker says, hey, this sucks, and they walk off the job, it doesn't change a lot. They just get fired. In that reality, knowing that the individual has to take that risk prevents them from taking those first steps that lead to collective action. If you want to think about maybe some governing points here as we get into the next conversation about how things have changed over time, I've taken some feedback and actually added Nixon and Reagan's faces at their respective inaugurations here. And you can kind of see a striking trend. Turns out that basically since the 1970s, there's been a precipitous decline in union membership in the United States and an increase in the share of income that goes to the top 10%. And, this actually kind of cuts off here. It's actually gotten much worse and at an accelerated rate over time. So instead, where you saw sort of a parity here, so think about this, putting this in context. Around 1933, around here, we see a federal guarantee that workers can join unions. And you start to see a moment here leading into the 1960s where there is a more equitable share of income going to the top 10%, coupled with an increase in union membership. It's almost like they're related. And part of that is that in the past, when unions were popular and unions were strong, membership in a union helped provide cover for the individual costs of striking and resistance. You might have heard of terms like community funding or mutual aid or even strike kitchens. Think about it. If you are a dock worker and you're going to walk off the job along with thousands of your fellow workers, you're also saying, hey, for the indeterminate amount of future, I'm not going to have a job. And so the way a union can help alleviate this is by collecting union dues and then providing income and food for dock workers and their families. And that kind of mutual aid is what allowed these strikes to go on for as long as they needed to in order to actually make progress and get the employers to acquiesce to their demands. Without that kind of protection, without unions there to create the space or the margins, as Odell says, for this kind of collective action to happen, it just doesn't. And since the 1960s, there's been a striking decline in the size of those margins for individuals. You know, think about all that, remember all that talk about communes back in chapter 2, and sort of the different social conditions that precipitated the flight to communes in the first place. The civil, social, and financial unrest of the 1960s and early 1970s also have introduced a lot of individual precarity. Couple that with declining union membership, and what you have is a workforce that is kept precarious, without the ability to organize, without the ability to really find security, and without the ability to find individual or collective security. How are you really going to go on a strike? How are you really going to be able to do that? The answer is you don't. So Jacob Hacker termed this period sort of as the writing of a new contract. So whereas before, during that period where unions were strong between basically like the mid-1930s to the 1960s, companies had an obligation to their workers. The threat of collective action and strikes meant that companies had to really consider the long-term incentives and the long-term interests of the workforce, in addition to the long-term incentives in the long-term structure of the company. But once union membership started to decline, and once we started to see that lack of security, which would have otherwise provided a cover for workers to find ways to operate, it's like in those margins, suddenly loyalty is off the table. The company owes you shit. And yet, you find yourself in a precarious spot. You owe the company your loyalty. You need to show up. You need to put in extra time. You need to work harder, because you know what? Maybe the company is going to notice. But I got a spoiler for you, they're not going to. But as a worker, you don't really have the option. Because workers in this new contract, without security, without unions, and like trapped in this cycle of precarity, are pitted against each other for their own survival in a race to the bottom. Like animals with nothing to lose, workers have to agree to lower wages, pay cuts, cuts in benefits, because they're more afraid of being fired than they are optimistic about what they could possibly get in the future. It's actually a very sad system. And it's not just workers that are feeling the pinch. You maybe have come across in your times on the internet, I know I sure have, these meme pages, spicy memes for depressed teens or something or other. They tend to follow the same general naming system. But what they do is they speak to a collective sentiment. It's very sad to see, especially among teenagers, an idea of hopelessness, of precarity, of mental anguish, anxiety, depression, a lack of a stable present or an optimism about a future. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say the punchline, well, guess I'll die, and then basically the laugh track is supposed to play? It's not funny. It's a true statement about that's couched within irony and humor to avoid having to directly say the shared reality. You know, doomer memes for depressed teens, stuff like that. The advent of the doomer and doomer memes. This idea of we're going to use humor to say the thing that we're afraid to say out loud, which is that there is very little to look forward to, and that the world is not what we thought it was going to be as we were growing up. I mean, shit, I'm 31. I graduated into the double dip recession of 2011. I remember seeing a lot of these jokes as we were coming up into graduation. I remember I had applied to graduate school. I didn't get in because there was a huge rush for people trying to run back into PhD programs to get the security there. And the backup jobs that I had lined up were all canceled when the grants that were funding them were canceled. And all of a sudden, here I was graduating with top honors and all these awards and all these accolades, and I had nothing to look forward to. Didn't have a job, ended up having to move back in with my parents, and couldn't even get hired at Starbucks. Here I was sitting in my childhood bedroom with all my plaques and awards from how good I was at undergrad. And I had no income, I had nothing to my name. And I just sat around depressed for a year. There wasn't a lot I could do. I couldn't even get hired at Home Depot. I tried. It was not a great time in my life. What I did do was I spent a lot of time on the internet, and I saw a lot of these memes from people that were in similar situations to me. And in a way, as dark as they were, they helped me feel a little bit less alone with the hell world that I found myself living in. I know, right? Flashbacks. Woo! So, Odell, while teaching at Stanford, comes across one of these meme pages and recognizes it for what it is. At Stanford, even the students are feeling the pressure of this precarity, this advent of competition, this race to the bottom where there are very few good jobs. There is intense pressure between students to stand out, and an informal norm to never talk about it if you're struggling. And so in this atmosphere of an isolated struggle, where intense competition is the norm and admitting struggle is taboo, these kinds of memes speak to that atomized desperation. So when I was an undergrad, I came across a website called PhD Comics. So it's a little bit small on your screen. So first panel, T equals 0 seconds. Grad student is happy, eating popcorn. Over time, they are racked with guilt, and all they can think about is after 1 hour how they should be working. Now, when I was an undergrad, a graduate student that I was working with in a research laboratory showed me this. And like, it's a long running comic series. Some of them were very funny. And I thought, ha ha ha, how funny that is. Surely that's just like a joke, right? That's not real. But then after getting into a PhD program, ultimately, I realized that these jokes were, much like the depression memes, really speaking to a shared experience of people that were in higher education. The constant pressure to work, the constant pressure to be productive, the constant pressure to always be doing better than everyone else. And that includes yourself, that you can never be satisfied, you can never be happy. And the constant reality of burnout that stems from that, coupled with, just like with undergrads at Stanford, the pressure to never actually talk about it when you're struggling. I stopped being able to read these comics. They weren't funny anymore. They became too real for me. And as a graduate student at a particular university in the American Southeast, the students and we sort of informally stumbled onto a weekly wine night. One of the bars in town did half-price pours of wine on Wednesday nights. And so we would get together, and we would, for $5, get in like on a bunch of cheap wine. And what you found consistently over time was that around after a third glass, somebody would stop and they would say, I don't know why I'm even here. I'm not good enough to be here. I'm burned out. I'm tired. I'm sleeping for 4 hours a night at best. I don't like, my research isn't working. And it would just start pouring out of them. And it would just become a whole cascade of people at the table. Everyone had these stories. And every week we had new stories about the ways that we felt atomized and isolated. We didn't think that we were actually going to be able to get jobs after we graduated. And there was a real sense of shared despair. And we could only talk about it while we were inebriated, because the pressure to always be performing well and always look like you had your shit together was intense and crushing. In fact, on the first day of my orientation, when I started my PhD, the head of our area told us a story and said, you know, when I was your age, whenever I would think about leaving for the night, I would stop for a second and I would think about how at some other university, there's probably another person who's in my cohort, that is to say, we're going to be going on the job market at the same time, and that person is staying to read one more article. And then I would look at that and I would think about that and I would stay and I would read 2 more. And that's how we were told to live from the jump. That was the atmosphere in the program. Hey, if you feel like stopping, if you feel like you're tired, if you feel like you're getting worked to the bone, stop and make up a person who's working harder than you and then try to work harder than them. That's not sustainable. It's not practical. It's not even realistic. And yet, it's what we all did. And I burned up very hard in grad school and eventually had to realize that that wasn't a way I could possibly live my life. Always telling because that's how you end up working 13, 14-hour days. And then going home and drinking 3 glasses of wine so you can sleep for 4 hours and you can wake up and do it all over again. It was not a great period of time. And a lot of the same feelings that I felt then are echoed in a lot of these memes. They're echoed in undergraduates, and they're echoed in even just the whole idea of ironic, absurdist memes, in doomer memes, as Mercury pointed out there in the chat. At really every level, we sort of exist in this very atomized state of precarity. We don't really have unions. We can't count on decent pay or decent benefits, and yet we're expected to just kind of go along with this system that ultimately hurts us. Yeah, exactly, Red Muffler Man. There were a lot of nights of crying myself to sleep in grad school. So when I'm reading this book and I'm talking about a lot of these elements of burnout and everything, particularly even when I connected to content creation, I think the atmosphere of content creation really, it hits me in the same part of my brain that grad school did. This pressure that, shit, you know what? Let's take this PhD comic and let's rework it a little bit. I'm sitting here watching a movie. Fuck, I should have been making content. I could have streamed today. I could have put up a new YouTube video. I could have tweeted more. I could have done X, Y, Z. You can always do more. And in a situation where you don't actually have security or precarity, in fact, systemically, your attempts to feel secure have been taken from you. All there really is internal guilt and fear. Wow, that got depressing. Let's talk about psychology for a second. Woo! Wah! Let me take a sippy after that one. All right. So, Maslow's Hierarchy, you might be familiar with this one. There's been some criticism of this lately in the literature, which I think is fair. So I'm not going to get too into the read. I'm not going to get too into the reads of the specific categories, but just suffice to say, think about this pyramid. What Maslow's hierarchy basically gets at is the idea that there are more basic needs that we have, and when those needs are not met, it is harder or impossible to meet those higher order needs. So in the original conception of it, we have our immediate physiological needs for air, water, shelter, sleep, etc. And then once we have those met, we can think about stuff like safety. And if you want to think about this across time, you have your very immediate sort of like lizard brain needs, and then once you have those met, it opens up the space to consider things like future planning, community, and then ultimately leading to your psychological health and self-actualization. But when we really think about the way that work and labor operates, particularly in the United States, there is a level of atomization and individualization that prevents us from really being able to achieve those basic needs. And think about this. Think about it this way. Why do you think that it is so controversial to try to have universal health care in the United States? I'll give you a second to think about that for a second. Got the answer? If you're like me, it's because systemically, not guaranteeing healthcare to everyone just as a virtue of, being a human being and a citizen of a country that's paying taxes means that your employer can literally hold your health and survival, like ability to survive, over you. How are you going to negotiate for higher wages or organize with your fellow workers if being fired, if you're, for example, a person with a chronic medical condition, could be a death sentence? I mean, I am lucky enough that I don't have a life-threatening condition, but I do have a chronic medical condition, and I have to make employment decisions with that in mind. It was one of the reasons I didn't pursue academia is because in many ways, particularly if you're pursuing until you get tenure, you have very little job security. And I couldn't see myself being able to survive in that environment. I've got chronic health needs. I need insurance. I need to be covered. I couldn't accept jobs. I couldn't accept a job adjuncting that didn't also cover my medical needs. It limited my ability to make moves and ability to pursue a career that I wanted. It's actually quite sad. But now I'm a Vtubing doctor, so I guess it all worked out in the end, right? So when we think about, remember how we thought about sort of collective action and individual attention, those two are inseparable. And when we're locked into isolated struggle, it prevents the recognition of collective struggle. So I want to bring up one tweet. Unfortunately, I came across this tweet today and then I lost it, but it pointed to this person setting the stage here. They're saying, hey, as a former CEO, I would tell my workers to come to me personally. Tell me what's going on. What's happening to you? What's going on in keeping you from being able, I know that fucker, right? To meet your goals. And as like the great stinger on that, yes, the Dan Price tweet, that's who it was. It was Dan Price. The stinger being, if somebody were to try to organize a petition or were to try to organize workers, Dan Price, CEO extraordinaire, would just fire them on the spot. So what does that actually do? Well, one, it prevents collective action, but it also locks workers in a cycle wherein they are always left to believe that their issues are personal and not systemic. If I didn't sit down and have those wine nights with my fellow grad students, I would never realize that the way that I felt was something that we all shared. I would never realize that there were systemic factors that were affecting me in much the same way they were affecting other people. And that's like kind of the root of it, right? It's like, we've talked about mindfulness, right? And like, remember the Amazon mindfulness booth? That kind of that solution works if your workers buy in, or at least you can sell it to workers, if they don't understand that their problems are systemic. Because systemic problems require collective solutions. But if you can keep people believing that their problems are individual, you can pull the wool over their eyes and you can tell them that, you feel terrible and you're stressed all the time and you're not really sleeping. Have you considered doing a 30-minute mindfulness meditation on your lunch break? It might help a lot. And if this sounds bad, it's because it is. How terrible. So why don't we just walk away? Why don't we walk into the woods? Well, we've already covered one base for this, right? That the total refusal, walking out into the woods, is unrealistic, and ultimately, immature action is the word that Odell points to in the book. And not everyone has the ability to walk away. Not everyone can go to jail for not paying their taxes. But this is one bit that this is where it really clicked for me on this passage. It's also important to understand that individual refusal, deactivating your Facebook and walking away, doesn't actually attack the foundation of the attention economy. Because that individual action still plays by the rules of privatization and individualism. It's an individual solution to a collective problem. And that doesn't necessarily produce results. And so if you loudly quit Facebook and then tweet about it, Facebook is not going to change. if you want to actually approach in that way, if you want that, if what your ultimate goal is I want to change the way that we think about labor, and I want to get out of the hell world of the attention economy, you need to think about it differently. You need to think about it collectively. And so Odell's point is to try to build that third space. Remember, Diogenes talks about, and the refuseniks are thinking about, they're operating in a third space, this liminal spot between refusal and participation. And so if you are a person who has the capital and the ability to do so, try to sow the seeds of later refusal. Critically engage with the content that you're served. Remember Diogenes, I will participate but not as asked. If somebody gives you a automatic ad, an unskippable ad, make fun of it. Don't watch it. Don't engage with it in the way that they want you to do. When I see promoted tweets on Twitter, I block the account so I never see them again. I don't need to engage with the brands on that way. Twitter wants to serve me these ads. All right, fine. I'll block every account so that I don't see them as often. Using ad blockers on corporate websites. Controversial, but possible. Yeah, and it's like, why do you think so many websites are built on the idea about opposing ad blockers? Part of it is built on the idea that they need to engage with your attention in those certain ways. And if you don't engage in those certain, don't engage like that, the system starts to break down. And those minor attempts, even just like saying, hey, there's an unskippable ad here, I'm going to go tab out and do something else. I'm not going to pay attention to it. In doing so, you ultimately train your ability to attend to information differently. And those small bits, yep, yeah, that's right. Is Akuma a weak character? I don't know. And you know what? I don't care. How's that for an answer? So in doing these even like small efforts and these small individual actions, they can help to build and set the stage for bigger actions later on. And the tiny spaces that an individual creates can connect to and build bigger spaces once they link up with other people. So when we think about becoming trees and then ultimately finding forests, we don't just emerge as fully formed trees. What we need to do is sow the seeds of the forest that we want to see, and work toward building the forest that we want to be part of. And that's the end of the chapter, but there's a little bit of an epilogue here. I know that, I think Erico brought this up earlier in the chat, but so this book was published in 2019, right? It was barely even 2 years ago. But a tremendous degree of stuff has happened since then that I think really speaks to the hopelessness and a little bit of hope when it comes to some of these conversations. So you might be familiar with the fact that in Alabama, Amazon workers attempted to unionize. And in I guess a bit of irony here, given that I am in fact participating in a society, I'm streaming to this live on Twitch, and then later on I'm going to post this to YouTube. I don't run ads on my channel personally. I don't need the money. My job already pays me more than enough to do very little. So I was surprised when I found out that Twitch was actually running ads on Amazon's behalf, even outside of Alabama, trying to exert social pressure on the budding unionization efforts in their Alabama warehouses to break the union before it even had a chance to start. And again, thinking about leverage, thinking about sort of strike breaking and the types of tactics that we see, this felt a lot like, or at least reading this book, this is immediately what came to my mind when I thought about the Longshoremen in the 1930s. The cloying ads and the attempts to be reasonable. You saw ads of people talking about how great it is to work at Amazon. You didn't so much hear the big ads campaigns run on Twitch about Amazon workers that are sleeping in their cars because they can't afford rent. Yeah, and also, like Raina pointed out here, it's like Twitch refusing to let you use an ad blocker while they're running union-breaking ads at you, even if you don't live in Alabama. The extent of the power that these organizations have. And you might also remember Prop 22 in California. Proposition 22 was a ballot initiative. Oh gosh, you live in Canada and you were getting those ads? Oh Jesus. So Prop 22 was on the ballot in November of 2020. Basically, long story short, this was an attempt to exempt organizations like Lyft, Uber, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmates, etc., to prevent them from having to classify their workers as employees and to be able to continue to classify them as independent contractors. Importantly, this would mean that they didn't have to give them benefits, including stuff like healthcare, time off, and all that, and so on and so forth. And these companies paid out the nose to get over Prop 22. It is, in fact, the most expensive campaign, one of the most expensive political campaigns in California's history, with these companies collectively forking out over $200 million to make sure that they could still classify their workers and drivers as independent contractors and not employees. And they won. They got what they wanted. And importantly, in exit polls, many voters had no, based on the wording of Prop 22 and how it actually was set up on the ballot, they thought they were actually voting in favor of the workers. It was deceptively worded. There was a massive and highly subversive ad campaign aimed at it. And you know what? They got what they wanted. It sucks, right? It makes you feel very hopeless. But there's a little bit of hope right now. You might have noticed there's been national news. I think this is too recent to really me to give anything but hot takes about. But when I see worker walkouts and strikes and a push for unionization over coronavirus, the handling of coronavirus, I feel a little bit of hope. I see a little bit of solidarity there. When you see fast food workers and restaurant workers saying, you know what, we're not going to show up, and their angry bosses sticking up signs in the windows saying, we can't find workers. It makes me think that maybe we could see a push for unionization, for collective effort and collective action, and maybe just a little pinch of solidarity. And maybe 2021 and on could be a little bit better than 2020 was. Love to see stuff like the PRO Act pass and all that. That's me being political on Twitch.com. But it gives me a little bit of hope. And that's where I'm going to end this here. That's what I got for today. It's Chapter 3, aka the Anatomy of Refusal. We're going to be getting into Chapter 4 next week.